So just to give you a quick overview of the running order today, the programme this morning has been jiggled around a bit, hasn't it? And we've now got it in 3 parts. So in a moment we're going to start the session with Sarah Jones MP and also Jess Phillips MP and find about their priorities and concerns. And you'll see them leaving sharply at 10:45 because they both have to attend a House of Commons debate, I think it is, on International Women's Day. So we're really grateful that you've managed to fit us in and swing by, but they do have to leave at 10:45. In the second part, we're going to show you the international multi-award-winning 5-minute film, Don't Cry, followed by a panel discussion with Andrea, who's also going to be joined by Lindsay Attenborough, good morning to you, and Samia Tozier to discuss the film and the issues it raises. I'll give them formal introductions later on. The third part of the event is with Baroness Burton, Louisa Rolfe and Catherine Hinwood, and we're going to look at the current situation in the UK when it comes to domestic abuse, violence and coercive control from a parliamentary safeguarding, policing and healthcare perspective. So that's an overview of the programme. We aim to finish the discussions of part 3 roughly around about 11:30, 11:40, and it means we don't have time for questions at the end. However, the panellists, apart from Jess and Sarah, will be around for about 20 minutes, so you can chat to them, maybe exchange contacts if you need any further information as well, or chat among yourselves. We need to leave this room by 12 noon. I don't know how officious they are at throwing us out, but very okay. There we go. So yes, we need to leave by 12 noon. We're holding the event, of course, during the week of International Women's Day. So our focus today is on women and girls. And of course, domestic abuse, violence and coercive control affects all genders and all types of relationships, but women and girls are disproportionately affected by domestic abuse. I think that's fair to say. Jess is nodding, so that's good. That's my mark. And the invitation to the event obviously highlighted that domestic abuse, violence and coercive control is affecting a growing number, sadly, of women and girls. Despite the hundreds of calls for help every week in the UK, nearly 2/3 of victims remain silent. While advances in policy, policing, healthcare and safeguarding are being made, there remains a huge challenge and gap in the UK today. So that really is the overview. Welcome to you all. So let's start actually by getting Sarah's thoughts as being our official host and sponsor to this event. Tell us about your support, first of all, Sarah, for Andrea's work and supporting other women in your constituency and further afield.
Well, Andrea had an event last year in New Addington, part of my constituency, which I couldn't go to, which was awful, sent a video, but she's been campaigning for years to try and raise these issues up the agenda, and using your own personal story is obviously deeply challenging. It's triggering, I imagine, every time the trauma that you've been through. So to be able to do that, to have that strength and to want to use it for good and to change things is really powerful. So really happy to host, which doesn't involve anything, by the way. As a sponsor, I haven't paid for this event or anything like that. I just had to book the room, which was quite easy, but I'm very, very happy to do it. So very pleased to be here.
And obviously you're Shadow Minister as well for policing and fire services. So just tell us a little bit about that and how that impacts this particular subject.
Yes, so in the Home Office there are kind of 3 bits. There's the police and there's security and there's immigration. And what the Labour Party said is that if we get into government there'll be 4 bits. So one bit will be Jess, which will be violence against women and girls, really putting that at the forefront of everything that we're doing, and she'll talk about that. So my role in policing is very involved in how the police do that, but a lot of what I'm also working on is how do we make sure women can trust the police enough to come forward when they have been the victims of crime. And there was a survey out this morning showing that women in particular really in London, this survey was do not have the trust in policing that we would want them to have. So whether that's around introducing national standards on vetting and misconduct and training, or whether it's around trying to get more women into policing, whether it's around the way that the police is structured and organised so that leadership can be of the right kind of cultures. There's a lot of work that I'll be focused on that hopefully will mean that women can regain a trust in policing, which has taken quite a big knock over the last couple of years.
Yeah, we've got Louisa Rolfe here as well for the panel on the third part, so it'd be interesting to get Louisa's comments and response to that as well. Jess, if I can bring you in as Shadow Minister for Domestic Violence and Safeguarding, what is the scale of the problem and how challenging is this issue?
I mean, the scale is massive. Last year, just reported to the police, flags of domestic abuse across the country was nearly 1 million, which if you compare to most of the violent crime types, dwarfs it absolutely massively. So it is, you know, the sort of single biggest unit of violent crime in our country. And that fundamentally is the problem that we have facing in challenging it. Because the reality is, unless you make an enormous priority of this across your across every single government department, across every single institution within you know, that makes up our society, you're just having a piecemeal approach and a sort of little pilot here, little thing here. It is a massive and growing problem. With what we want to always see is an increase in reporting. Like I actually don't want to see the reporting dropping, because as you've said, 2/3 of women don't report. I imagine it's much, much higher than that actually is the reality, because every woman in this room will have suffered some form of male violence, without doubt. Hands up, how many of you reported it to the police? There you go. I mean, it's like it's a tiny fraction. The vast majority of things that happen to us we just think are part of our normal life and to be expected about how we go about our business. And when you're dealing with that level of volume, you know, I'm talking about like institutions like the NHS. You know, it is an enormous problem, and yet what we do is have it being a tiny bit of one department.
So there's a huge challenge, isn't there? We're going to be discussing that in our part 3 as well. I'm going to be reading out later on a message from the Domestic Abuse Commissioner, but prior to that, research that I've looked at reveals huge inequalities for survivors, which they've put together, trying to access domestic abuse services across England and Wales. That's if you can get them, as you said, representing a postcode lottery and a patchwork of provision. The specialist services, I'm sure it's no surprise to you, Jess, for domestic abuse are often understrained and underfunded. So what realistically can be done to change that situation, and how can you change the dial as well, Jess?
The first and foremost thing is that there needs to be a statutory duty on community-based services for domestic abuse. We made that statutory duty, which, to explain that, the statutory duties that local authorities used to have was that they had to provide social services, so adult and children's social care, and bins. Those were the two things that they had to provide by law. We managed to change the law to say that they now have to provide refuge accommodation. So women fleeing now are as important as bins. Make no mistake, and we are currently, women's safety in policy is currently, so now we matter as much as bins, we don't, is the reality, and we don't matter anywhere near as much as cars, or trains, or even boats. I mean, in fact, on boats, they've got women licked every single time with regard to public policy. So we have to make a statutory duty now. Only 30% of women flee to refuge. 30% of women who come forward will ever see the inside of a refuge. The vast majority of women are supported within their community, and supported even when they don't leave their perpetrators. This is the reality of the situation. And unless we make a statutory duty that every single public body, and I don't just mean local authorities, that every single NHS commissioner in the country is commissioning specialist domestic abuse and sexual violence services. It is a phenomenon to me that you will have mental health trusts across the country who don't specifically fund any women's only trauma-based sexual violence crisis support, for example. It's costing them dear in every single area. Like, every single public commissioning body that interacts with people should have to commission specialist support services within the community. So that's one way. Obviously, the government voted against that. else a breeze. There's a number of other issues that I know that Nicole, the Domestic Abuse Commissioner, highlights with the inequality of access to service. I mean, don't even get started on children. There is no services for children who are living with domestic abuse, and we should not pretend otherwise. The vast majority will see no form of specialist service care or interaction. So, and we cannot just say schools have got to do it, because schools in my constituency, for example, are already social workers, housing officers.
A lot on their plate.
Cooking food for the kids. Also, they're trying to teach them maths and English. We have got to put in place provision to support children as part of any framework. So the DfE, the Department for Education, needs to massively step up in this regard. But one of the areas which got worse this week by a long way is the division between support that you can access depending on whether you were born in this country or whether you were not. And as somebody who represents, and I'm sure Sarah would echo this, representing Croydon, I represent Birmingham. Currently, the situation with regard to access to support services for migrant women who've come on spousal visa, who've come on non-spousal visas, on student visas, on work visas, if they are abused in our country currently, SOS, I'm afraid to say, is the answer in the vast majority of funding for them to go into refuge, for example.
So just on that, obviously, we've mentioned postcode lottery, migrant survivors as well, children, and the other two key areas the Commissioner's focusing on. Just a quick thought from you: family courts and the criminal justice system.
I mean, the family courts should be stopped and started again. That's my attitude to that. It's an absolute disgrace what happens in the family courts in our country. So, for example, a constituent of mine had taken a case through the criminal proceedings about her husband raping her, and it was not, it was no further action. What a surprise! That's what happens in 99% of cases of sexual violence, and in even higher rates sexual violence within intimate relationships. But it was found in the family court that in a rare instance, it was found in the family court that he had raped her, and he even agreed to it. Then we tried to get the family court to go back to the criminal court. They don't talk to each other. So a man has admitted to raping a woman in a family court, and somehow that isn't enough evidence for our criminal courts. That's a massive problem. Women routinely have their children removed from their care and given to very dangerous men. The Women's Aid report 19. Child homicides refers to the 19 children murdered by their husbands, by their fathers, the women's partners and husbands, after the decision of the family court to give them back to them. The family court system is absolutely, it is an extension, a bit like what is happening this week with regard to modern slavery. It is an institution where the government, and it's not just this government, but that whole institution is a tool for perpetrators. We are literally providing a tool for them to continue abusing, and that has got to change.
So just conscious of time for both of you. Finally, Sarah, and maybe Jess wants to come in as well. It doesn't sound as though there's political consensus around sort of policy, strategy and legislation when it comes to domestic abuse, violence and coercive control. So what can you do on behalf of your constituents and further afield to change that?
Well, I mean, obviously, politically speaking, we'll push for a change of government, and until that point, we have to do what we can, and we have to try and build bridges and alliances and campaign as much as possible. I mean, I have done a lot of work in the past around knife crime, and it is extraordinary the correlation between the people that the boys that go out and are violent and are the same boys that have witnessed domestic abuse in the home. The correlation is right there. So when knife crime increases and everybody rightly, wants the police to do more and wants everybody to do more, if you're looking at how to stop the crime in the first place, you really need to start with domestic violence in the home. So there are a lot of battles to fight and victories to win, and there are lots of brilliant police officers. Louise is here. You know, there are brilliant allies in all kinds of areas, and we just have to make those arguments and keep it up the agenda. It's an issue, isn't it, that goes up and down the agenda, sadly, according to
deaths.
And we need to keep it there all the time.
And I know, Jess, you get a running order, don't you, every day of people dying
so
on a WhatsApp group.
So today I will read out the list of the names of women who have been killed by men in the last year, and the list is sent to me a week ago, so that we can sort of start finalising any of the details about their families and things. And then obviously throughout this week I just receive a daily update of the name of the woman who's died today. Whilst when I walked into this room, there was another one added to the list as I walked into the room. It's look, I actually think there is quite a lot of policy consensus, or at least there's legislative consensus across all political parties, apart from the migrant thing. Let's face it, they care more about what's in your passport. I mean, I can make no bones about this, that if you present currently as a victim of rape, domestic abuse or modern slavery, your passport and what it says in it is of more concern to the current government than catching your perpetrator. The end. Write that in your newspapers. This has just got much, much worse. I am absolutely appalled by what has been happening in the last week. To say that people cannot access a woman who has been repeatedly raped as part of a trafficking, to say that if she arrived here illegally against her will, she will not be able to access, not even be able, and they say, oh, we'll let the genuine people through. How will you know if you cannot enter into the system? That's like saying you can come through this door, but it is locked. It is. I could actually cry at how terrible this is, and how dangerous, and how it's going to be terrible for the police. It will make things harder for the police, where prosecution in these cases are already very, very difficult. So there is no policy consensus on that. However, there is a huge amount of policy consensus across the board, but what there isn't is political will. When Rishi Sunak stands in front of a podium that says stop the killing, I'll believe it's his priority. It isn't. There is no political push to make this, and they'll say, oh, we've given it 500 million, which is more than we've ever given it before, which is rubbish, utter rubbish, because actually in local authority funding, where the vast majority of domestic abuse support services, housing, etc. comes from, has been totally and utterly decimated. So at anything, we're at a net loss, let alone being in an uptick. Regardless, as well as the NHS and all the other services, the police that have been cut, add it all in, we're at a massive dent and loss. What a surprise that the numbers keep going up. But I don't think that they don't care. I just don't think that they care as much as they care about pretty much everything else, including, as I go back to, bins and cars.
Well, Jess, keep banging the drum on behalf of everybody. And the same for you, Sarah. Thank you so much indeed.